Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or good morning from wherever in the world you're joining this conference. I have to first of all say thank you to the organizers of this second international conference on management research and economic development for the invitation to give one of the keynote addresses and research work for this particular conference. It is an honor. For this particular presentation, I'm going to be focusing on an earlier work that I have done on gender inequality and kind of thinking about its macroeconomic implications. Before I start, I should introduce myself. My name is Dr. Ruth Badru. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, and a lot of my work is in this sort of area of looking at macroeconomic consequences of social identifiers or different social strata in the economy. And today, what I really want to focus on is the effects of gender wage differentials and women's bargaining power on aggregate expenditure and potentially also economic development and growth. I think before I start, is a good place to always give a broad introduction of what the research questions, the key research questions are. And the truth of the matter is that we know that gender wage inequality has gained a lot of attention in the last couple of decades. It is still a significant challenge across the globe, across both developing and developed economies. While a lot of attention is often paid on the effects in developing nations, there is much less research into how gender wage inequality, which still persists in developed nations in the world, affects macroeconomic outcomes. There's a lot of research in the micro space, but in the macro space, there is a gap that still needs to be filled. And that's what we try to do with this research paper. And particularly, we attempt to answer two key questions. So the first question is very simple. How does gender wage differential affect aggregate consumption? We know that aggregate consumption from our simple macroeconomics is the largest component of GDP. So if gender wage inequality has any significant effect on aggregate expenditure, we can expect that that also has a significant effect on economic growth and economic development as well. So this is where we start our analysis off, and we create some background to the story, present some stylized facts. The second thing we then try to do is examine how effective demand and economic growth are sort of linked. So if we then manage to close this gender wage gap, how does this affect effective demand in the economy, and what are the potential effects on economic growth? And by answering these questions, our goal here is to better understand the broader economic effects of gender wage inequality and also explore potential policy solutions, and not just thinking about it from a microscopic level, but looking at the aggregate lens of the economy. So in this presentation, what I am going to share is research from my findings. I will combine findings from this paper and subsequent other papers that I have worked on relating to gender inequality from a macroeconomic lens. But for this particular study, I'm focusing on a sect of developed economies, specifically Canada, the US, Australia, and the UK. And the reason I focus on these economies is because of their very unique nature and similarities in terms of their economic development potentials and trajectory over time, and also their interconnectedness with the British Empire, if you might say that. Also, more interesting is the fact that when we think about these four economies that we're focusing this research on, there is often the case that we are seeing a pattern where over time, gender inequality has fallen, yes, but there is still a very large sect of women who are not in the labor market. Now, the story is quite interesting because when we think about developing economies, we often think about the number of women who are unemployed or the number of women who are not represented in the labor market sector. But the truth of the matter is that there are more women often represented in the labor market in developing economies than they are in developed economies. This is mostly because in developing economies, a lot of women are employed in the informal sectors, so informal and unemployment rather. A lot of women maybe have small kiosks or small stores where they sell goods from, or they engage in petty trade or services, providing this to other households. Whereas within developed economies, these informal sectors are sufficiently very small that when we do not account for them in the overall percentage of women who are employed in the economy, it doesn't make that much of a difference as it would in developing economies. And we often find that in developed nations, there are more women missing from the labor force than there are in developing economies. And that brings the question, what is the overall effect of this on economic development, on economic growth? How does this impact on aggregate consumption? And we're not just looking at just the metrics here, we're looking at the underlying assumptions. So do women spend differently than men, for example? Do they have a higher propensity to consume, or a higher marginal propensity or average propensity to consume? What does the story tell us? In this graph on the right, what we see is that there is this persistent gender gap. It's reduced over time, but it still remained above 15% even in recent years. And this persistent nature requires some degree of exploration. And if we compare this to the literature, which has shown that more often than not, consumption patterns for men and women are actually quite gender specific. For example, women tend to spend more on their children than men, especially in terms of spending on things that we call sort of like ultra productive development or ultra productive capacities. And by that, what I really mean is that it might not necessarily be payment for their education, but women tend to spend more on ensuring that the children are okay, maybe providing for them for simple healthcare sustenance or simple healthcare support, or kind of supporting their children in a much more personal level. And if you think about the feminist literature that thinks of humans, the labor force, ourselves as a produced means of production, while we might not be able to economically quantify this input of women on their children, for example, in their individual households, we might be able to assume that this has a significant effect in ensuring that the labor force that we have in future years are much more developed or much more advanced or much more productive, depending on what lens you choose to look at this from. They're healthier, they're maybe much more skilled, they're much more supported, much more emotionally, or have a better mental well-being, which is essential for productive labor as well. So there's some sort of indirect links and indirect ways in which if women spend more on their children, for example, which is what the literature suggests, then this might have a much more positive effect on the labor force in the future. And so while we might think about the short-run effects on consumption, we also want to think about the long-run effects on aggregate consumption. Because if the labor force is more productive, that probably means that they're able to earn higher wages in the future. That probably means they're able to spend more in the future. So you see, there's a link here that is not quite as direct, and that is what we try to capture through our econometric analysis. And just to kind of make the research questions that we're asking much more broad and much more focused, we have a few research questions here. So the key research questions are in three broad categories. So if we're thinking about the effect of gender wage differentials on aggregate consumption, we're doing this specifically in the context of these 4 developed economies. And we also want to think about what the impact, like I said earlier, of closing the gender gap would be on effective demand and economic growth. And we finally want to think about, if we look at it from the lens of female or women's bargaining power in the labor market, how might this affect consumption patterns and how might this affect aggregate demand? And in doing so, we base this on a set theoretical framework. And our theoretical framework assumes that the marginal propensity to consume out of female income is higher than out of male income. And this is not such a broad assumption to raise, because if we assume, like we say, and the data proves that women earn lower wages than men, this also kind of classifies women in that sector of lower wage earners. And we've proven over time from work done by Blinder and co. that women's, or rather the income or lower income earners tend to spend a higher proportion of their income than higher income earners. And if this is true, if women are also earning lower than men, then we can also make that correlation, and that we could potentially make that correlation that women potentially also spend a larger fraction of their income than men do because they earn a lower amount of money or income than men do. The second hypothesis is related, but also in some sense might seem slightly contrary. It is related in the sense that we assume that as women's wages increases, all things equal, we expect them to consume more. So in that case, women are consuming more than men. But it's sort of contrary in the sense when you think about it that, well, if women's wages start to increase, that might make them or bring them to an equitable position with men. in which case there might not be any distinction in their marginal propensities to consume anymore. But then the reason we still assume this is because we think of it this way. If we're making our assumptions based on the fact that we know that women spend differentially from men, they spend on different household products or household goods and services or commodities than men, then it's also likely that if they're spending on their children, it's the maternal instinct that drives that expenditure. And if their income increased, they would still continue to spend that amount or even more on their households or on members of their households. So it's not just the lower income incentive that drives them to consume a higher proportion of their income. It's also the situational social structure that influences their decision-making process. And if you think about it as well, from the sense that, because there's literature that suggests that if women's income increases, their saving also increases. We do not try to contradict this literature. In fact, we accept this hypothesis, we accept this stylized fact, and assume further that it is not just that their saving increases as their income increases, their consumption also increases. So it's not a case that every additional income earned is immediately saved. It is that from every additional income earned, a proportion is consumed, a proportion is saved. So that means that their MPC expands, their saving also expands. So as the marginal propensity to consume expands, so also their proportion of saving, not necessarily even their proportion, but their average amount of saving also increases. So there's a story here that we're trying to tell, and how whatever lens you look at it, we expect that women probably spend a lot more on what we term as productive means than men probably do. And this is based on the data, this is based on microeconomic evidence. And if these assumptions hold through, their hypothesis, if they hold through, then we could also assume that if there's this higher degree of gender equality in wages, this would also change the consumption of, or the composition of consumption in a way that further benefits the future labor force. Again, going back to the whole hypothesis that labor itself is a produced means of production. And this theoretical framework expands or helps us to extend our typical consumption function, which forms our formal model for this analysis. So we know from, again, macroeconomic theory that consumption is usually based on or composed of the autonomous and the induced components. So we have the autonomous components, but then for the induced components, which is a function of income, we kind of separate income into two. So we assume that out of national income, there is wage income, which is money or income earned from work. And then there's profit income, which is income that accrues to capital owners from their investment activities. And when we think about wage income, if we separate wage income, we can then think of wage income as being formed of two parts: income earned by women and income earned by men. And this sort of gives us the total story of what wage income encapsulates. And again, based on the data that we showed before, we can assume, and actually based on fact here, that female income, or the total income earned by women, is typically lower than the total income earned by men. And this forms our formal model and influences our empirical analysis that follows. So for our empirical model, we simply assume that we want to now see how these relative wages of women versus men affects the overall consumption share in the economy. And when we think about consumption share here, we think about it as household consumption as a share of gross national disposable income. And we use GNDI here as a very comprehensive measure of the total income available to the nation for consumption or saving. So this measure helps us to understand much more domestic consumption patterns in the context of the total resources that are available in these particular economies that we analyze. And so in our CS variable here, then represents this ratio of household consumption to gross national disposable income. And then our key variable is our RW variable. Our RW variable is the ratio of female wages to male wages. And this is the variable that really tells us about how the marginal propensities to consume for women might differ from men. Again, given that this is a ratio of female wages to male wages, we use median wages here. The assumption is that this ratio will be less than 1 because we know that women's median wages are typically less than men on average. And another interesting variable that we have here is bargaining power. So yes, the relative wage RW variable is our key variable, but we thought it's not just enough to really account for what's happening to just labor income. There's also a degree with to which women's agency matters in their labor market outcomes, and as well as their ability to use their own income, their access to discretionary income, and how this might affect consumption overall. So think about it this way. Our bargaining power variable is actually a composite measure, and this measure in many ways captures the multifaceted influence of women in the labor market and their economic decision-making capacity. And to do this, we combine data related to women's labor force participation in the four economies that we analyze individually, their discretionary income, as well as their representation in senior managerial roles in each of those economies. So this is again where I said that there is a little bit of management in this economic research. And so our BP variable here, where we have a positive coefficient, this would indicate that as women's influence increases, the share of household consumption out of national income also rises. And the suggestion would be that empowering women can economically boost consumption levels and drive economic growth. More than that, also, this BP variable also gives us an insight into sectorial composition of women. So if women are more highly employed or engaged in the labor force, are they in senior managerial roles? Does that matter for the coefficients that we observe for our RW variable? And I think these are very important questions to ask in this particular case. And of course, we have other control variables, real interest rates, per capita income, because we also want to make sure that our RW variable is not capturing noise that is related to per capita income or income per head in the economy. And as usual, we use annual time series data for this macroeconomic analysis. Our four countries here at the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. So our methodological strategy is diverse. So we use an autoregressive distributed lag model for co-integration first. And this methodology is particularly important to us because it allows us to distinguish between short and long run dynamics. So we want to see what the short run dynamics are. We expect as income increases, consumption probably responds immediately, which should be fair. But we also want to see, is this relationship stable over time? Would this relationship be, if there are shocks in the short run in the economy, for example, would it be corrected over time to give us a clear idea that this is a sustained relationship based on the statistics that we observe from our regression analysis? And we also run several robustness tests where we include additional explanatory variables to check the consistency of our results. These are not reported here for time's sake. We also run Granger causality tests to check the direction of the effects of the relationships that we explore. And like I said, we use the autoregressive distributed lag model, which captures long and short run dynamics and thinks about how past effects of a particular variable might affect its current values or its current outcomes. So these are our first set of results, and these are our long run results for all four country cases. And I think we have a very interesting set of results here. In fact, what we see is that the coefficient for our RWE variable is quite incredibly similar for all four countries and ranges between 0.3% to 0.36%, which is incredibly similar. And more than that, though, when we look at variables like per capita income, we do not have any conclusions or any significant results for the UK and the US. Well, we do for Australia and Canada in the long run, but these are negative, which is very interesting, almost the opposite of what we would expect, that if per capita income is increasing, that should most certainly increase the consumption share. But if this is not quite the case and this is leading to a reduction in the consumption share, that can tell us either of two things. It could either be that this per capita income that is increasing is accruing to higher income earners who already consume a lower fraction of their income. And as such, this higher income is not translating to higher consumption. Instead, potentially it is translating to higher saving. The other side of the story might be that this higher income is accruing to profit owners. So it's capital income and not necessarily wage income. And we know, of course, that capital income, the proportion of consumption out of that share of income is much lower than the proportion of consumption out of wage income. And this is especially interesting when we then go back to look at our RW variables, because having captured these potential effects coming from higher income or capital income earners, our RW variables give us a much more clear and distinct picture of what's happening to female versus male wages. And here we observe that for all three countries, we have positive coefficients, which suggests that if women's wages increased by 1% relative to male wages, holding male wages constant, this would lead to a 0.3% increase in consumption share out of national income for each of these four economies, which is a considerable amount and a plausible number as well to assume for these four nations. What is also very interesting is when we look at the bargaining power variable. Again, remember that this is our long run relationship here. We're not even quite in the short run yet. So this ties back into the story of if we think about labor as a produced means of production, what might be the indirect effects of female wage gap reductions be as we move on from the short run period to the longer term period and thinking about future labor force. So that gives us some sort of insight there that there is a persistent long run relationship here. And that is a very good policy argument to say, causing the gender wage gap, while it is a serious humanitarian issue, the economic costs to not doing so in the long run as well. And when we look at these results here for our BP variable, which is our bargaining power variable, it is interesting that we do not find any statistically significant effects for the US in the long run, but for the UK, for Australia, and for Canada, we find some significant effects. And this gives us some insight into, well, it's not just that women's wage gaps might be closing, and this might be leading to increased demand in the economy and potentially increased growth in the economy. It's also that women are getting into higher managerial positions, for example. There are more women concentrated in the labor force, for example, and this has higher implications for aggregate demand in the economy. And this is especially significant when you think about the fact that for developed economies versus developing economies, what we often see is that there are more women concentrated in the labor force in developing nations. Yes, many of them may be concentrated in informal sectors, but there's a larger proportion of women who are actually working and earning a living in developing economies than in developed economies. And this kind of tells a story of where women are working and tells a story that where women are working, the sectors in which they're working, the positions in which they're earning income actually also matters for developed nations as well. And if we think about the error correction term, which is what the term that provides insight into the speed of adjustment to the long run equilibrium in response to any sort of short run shocks or deviations, we can see that these are all negative and statistically significant, which indicates robust adjustment mechanisms present towards equilibrium in this model. So that corroborates our long run coefficients where they're statistically significant to give us a clearer insight into the fact that there is a long run relationship at play here. There is a long run equilibrating relationship at play here in how gender or gendered factors affect macroeconomic conditions. So this brings us to our short run story. Our short run is a little bit more interesting, and the results are in some sense slightly contrary than what we thought. Quite frankly, I expected that in the short run, the observed effects of higher female wages holding men's constant will be much more pronounced. We only see that in the UK, but not in the other countries, so to say. In fact, for Canada, we do not even find any significant effects. For the US, the effect is much more smaller than our 0.3 that we saw in the long run. This is interesting because when we look at the BP variable, the effect is considerably very, very strong. And I believe, and this is also an assumption, that what this tells us is that as women's bargaining power increase and women are more concentrated in higher paying sectors or in higher paying jobs, this might be a key driver that explains how they might increase their consumption spending or their consumption making decisions. And if you think about it in the sense of as you enter a higher paying role, you're technically in a much more secure job. You're in a more secure point in your career. You're in a higher paying sector than if you were in a lower paying job. And this sort of level of security might influence your consumption decisions and might allow you to feel much more safe, for lack of a better word, in spending a bit more on your kids and their future development and things of the sort, or even other consumption activities, even luxury goods consumption, for example, similar to men. And this is a very important story because what this tells us that in the short run, it's not just women's wages increasing that matters, it's their position in the labor market that significantly drives these consumption effects. In which case, it does make sense, as we've said, earlier as well. And it might be also the case that if you're in a lower paying job or lower paying sectors, you might tend to save a little bit more for the rainy day than if you had a higher bargaining position. In the UK, the story is slightly different. Bargaining power still matters, and significantly so, and more strongly than we found in the long run. But we also see a very strong wage effect on consumption in the short run in the UK. And one of the theories that we're working with and that we're actually working on in the expansion or the extension of this paper is that the sectorial compositions of these economies matter, as well as their structural patterns or their structural component. Are these more export-oriented economies that are very industrial and are built on manufacturing and export intensive industries, which, for example, the US is, especially when compared to the UK. In which case, if you have a higher concentration of manufacturing companies or industries, you're likely to be more concerned with cutting production costs to increase profit and markups, or at least firms are more likely to do so. And in which case, if you're able to afford cheaper labor, which might be female labor, then why not? Whereas in the service-based or finance-based sector like the UK, it is possible that women's earning capacity or improved earning capacity tend to coincide with them in being in higher paying jobs or higher paying sectors like finance, for example. Well, again, this is a hypothesis, but it's just an interesting insight that we try to explore further in the recent version of the paper. For Australia and Canada, we do not see any significant BP effects, but we see significant RW effect for Australia. For Canada, the story is very different in the short run. In the short run, there are no significant relative wage or bargaining power effects on short run outcomes, contrary to what we would have expected. Another thing that's also interesting is that, again, here we still see that changes in per capita income have a negative effect where significant, and even in the UK, where not significant. This gives us some interesting story about how different the short run dynamics might be in terms of thinking about gender effects versus when we think about it from a long run perspective. We also do Granger causality tests to give us an idea into the direction of effects. What we do find in a nutshell is that this confirms that there is a long and short run effect coming from our gendered variable to consumption share, similar for our bargaining power variable for most of our country cases apart from Canada. Again, what we do see here is that for Canada, we do have quite a lot of no's where we do not find any unidirectional or bidirectional causality, which kind of further corroborates the findings that we had, especially for our short run results where a majority of those coefficients were not statistically significant. So just to summarize, in terms of our conclusions, one of the key things that we find with this paper is the fact that, well, our initial hypothesis or initial theoretical hypothesis is sort of proving true in the sense that if we assume that the ratio of female wages increases by 1%, this leads to an increase in household consumption share by almost up to 0.4% in the UK, the US, Australia, and Canada in the long run. And this tells us that our long-run marginal propensity to consume out of income is higher for women than it is for men. And if this is the case, what we would assume is that if there's this increase in household consumption share due to female wages increasing, this leads to an increase in aggregate demand, which could lead to an increase in economic growth, which could potentially imply that a wage-led growth or a wage-led recovery from any sort of business downturn in the business cycle is possible. So by putting more money in the hands of women, we're potentially able to stimulate growth in these economies. Another thing that is also interesting when we think about our short-run results is that while it is not conclusive for Canada, for the UK, Australia, and the US, we do see that this higher degree of gender equality can positively affect aggregate demand in the economy. And that is really quite critical because it tells us that greater gender inequality is not a good thing if we're thinking about promoting economic development and prosperity in an economy. So it's not just a humanitarian concern, there's an economic cost to not promoting gender equity in the labor market. And of course, like we said, higher bargaining power has a role to play because it's not just about whether women are earning more, it's about what kind of jobs are women concentrated in.
What kind of sectors are they in? What kind of roles do they have in those sectors? And to bring the picture a little bit clearer to our composition, because this is one of the questions that we also wanted to ask. What does it matter when we think about the composition of expenditure? Is there a different story that comes into play here? And we do a further analysis to look at this for our 4 country cases. And what we do find is that for the US and Australia specifically, we see that a higher relative income in the hands of women actually leads to increased household spending in areas such as children's education and their healthcare, which is again tying up that point about if women are contributing to the productivity, the well-being, the quality of the labor force of the future, then their consumption cannot be underestimated. And we see that this is clearly the case in the US and Australia as women's higher wages directly correlates with higher expenditure in healthcare and education in these economies. And of course, this finding really does tell us that when we promote gender wage equality, this can have far-reaching benefits beyond just immediate economic gains. And by directing more household spending towards education and healthcare, for example, gender equality can lead to very long-term improvement in human capital as well as in societal well-being. And this is a story that has also been told by many other authors via qualitative analysis. And this is just sort of bringing numbers into it and giving us some statistical reference to say, well, when we think about it from a purely mathematical point of view or empirical point of view, there is the data to back up these potential conclusions. And of course, just to provide an overview, what we have found here with this research is that closing the gender wage gap matters, and not doing so imposes an economic cost to society, and not just in the short run, but also in the long run when we think about long-term economic development. And while our results are not consistent across the board, we can, for almost based on our data and based on the work that we find, we can much more confidently say that women have a higher marginal propensity to consume than men out of income, which can have a higher potential impact on aggregate demand and positive impacts as well. And so when we think about policies, what can the government do? What is the way forward? I mean, while our research cannot really tell us so much about what the policy implications should be or recommendations should be, it gives some insight into how we need to think about not just legislation, for example, that promotes gender equity. We need to think about how those legislation work. For example, if we have quotas, if we give quotas to companies to say you must have this share of women and this share of men as part of your employed labor force, it's not just enough for there to be enough women in the company and enough men in the company in proportion. It's also important to think about what roles are women having, what roles are women being employed into in those companies? Are they on lower wage scale? If we're thinking about the company's hierarchical structure, where do women stand there? Because that really matters. And that really matters for progress as well, not just for the organization, but for the economy at large. And if we think about labor market policies that are much more gender aware, have allowed for this dual carer, dual earner family model where women do not feel like there's a cost attached to them leaving the labor force to have a child, for example. Those are the kind of policies that we need to really think very critically about when implemented to ensure that women are not disadvantaged out of the labor force, which is often the case with developed nations, and why we see a lower labor force participation in developed economies compared to developing economies. And of course, gender pay gaps are an unfortunate reality that I believe can be changed over time. And while the data just suggests that there is a downward trend, I think it's important for there to be active government policies that try to reduce that gap in real time as well. I'd just like to say thanks to everyone for listening to this. And if you, of course, do have any questions, I'm very sure that the organizers of this conference would be very happy to field your questions to me, and feel free to reach me via email. Thank you very much.